The present situation, as Regina mentioned, on global food insecurity is absolutely awful. The UN departments, etc., had slowly been reducing over several decades the number of hungry, malnourished people in the world. But in 2019, that decline switched and it started increasing quite rapidly.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'll be your host as we discuss food security and climate chaos. I really actually should say as we discuss food insecurity, because that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, I hate to start us off on bad news, but one thing that we know that living beings can't live without, and that's food and water. We do know we've had a few shows that have discussed the water crisis. That's something that's very real and happening. But we also need to talk about the food crisis. And when I say food crisis, I mean now in different parts of the world and the coming food crisis for many other parts of the world. We've talked about parts of Africa, countries that are on the brink of not having enough food to feed their populace. We've also talked about the Central American Dry Corridor, often referred to as the CADC. This encompasses 4 countries: El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Major countries. And what have we seen in the last few years, and especially the last year? But a lot of migration from these very regions to the United States. I'm not talking about migration, say, from places like Venezuela who are suffering other ills and are therefore migrating to the United States. I'm specifically talking about the Central American Dry Corridor. A lot of people in this region rely on subsistence farming. They provide food for their families and for the greater community in their region. And the problem is when you have rain that is unstable, that doesn't fall as often as it used to, that has this very fragile balance, there's a great deal of difficulty in growing crops. Not just that, but the crops that do grow, specifically corn, grow very much smaller. The quality is not as good. And then we can look to the livestock. Just like human beings, livestock need water. Talking about cows, goats, and there are so many farmers who depend, small farmers, who depend on cows and goats and chickens for their livelihood in this Central American Dry Corridor. And when there's no rain and no rain and no rain, the very animals that they depend on for survival can die of thirst. And when they die of thirst and then there's no crops to grow, we have the need to move to larger cities. These could be, of course, larger cities within Central America. It's very problematic because a lot of these people may not be as educated as those urbanites who have been in the area for a long time. And perhaps it's very difficult for them to find suitable labor. So, they could be victims of criminal enterprises, many of them are. And when that happens and they fear for their safety and that of their family, they have to go somewhere else. So we see a lot of destabilization, a lot of chaos, and it's something that we're going to continue to see. Food security is something that it really needs to be fundamental to human life and to all life. It's not something that should be used as a bargaining chip for various terrorist organizations, and we've seen that happen as well. When we have less and less food in this world, which we're going to see, we are going to see corruption. We are going to see bad people who control who gets the food, who gets the water, how much they charge. And it's going to cause a lot of suffering in this world. I know that food insecurity is something that's near and dear to your heart, Peter, And I'm wondering what you have to say on this topic of food security and climate chaos.
Thanks very much, Regina. I'm really, really pleased that you said the title really is Food Insecurity. Very smart of you. You're always on the ball. But unfortunately, that really is the case. And that applies to the entire world. We have now entered an age of climate disruption, food insecurity. From now on, it's only going to get worse. The main reason for that, of course, is extreme weather events. IPCC 6 assessment told us for sure extreme weather events are increasing. They're increasing at a rapid rate. They're affecting all regions, populated regions of the planet, and they are going to increase at an increasing rate. So I'll just go through the number in a minute. But I wanted to point out some numbers. It gets a little difficult, talking the science, particularly of food, and not including what you, of course, wisely have included, which is the moral and ethical aspect, because that's really all important. So the sixth assessment said that if our governments continue on their present track, on their present policies, that we will reach this century a global temperature increase of 3.2 degrees C. Now, at least 15 years ago, the science had established that at 3 degrees C of global warming, all crops in all regions are in decline. So our governments, I mean, it is an indescribably terrible thing that they're doing. They are continuing to push more fossil fuels, $7 trillion a year in subsidies now, and they are committing us to a future of global agricultural collapse at 3.2 degrees C. Now, another thing is that we are already committed, no matter what the optimistic, hopeful scientists tell us, we're committed to a global warming of 2.5 degrees C. That's by present radiative forcing, which is extremely high, well over 3 watts per meter, and the energy imbalance, which has doubled in the past decade or so. So the forcing, which the scientists measure from our constant accumulation of lower atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions, commits us to a temperature increase of over 2 degrees C already. And frankly, we'd better acknowledge that and we'd better face up to that, because maybe then we can force our governments to do something differently. The present situation, as Regina mentioned, on global food insecurity is absolutely awful. The UN departments, etc., had slowly been reducing over several decades the number of hungry, malnourished people in the world. But in 2019, that decline switched and it started increasing quite rapidly. So today, the FAO does these publications every year. And in July of this year, the FAO published its World Food Insecurity. We've now reached about 900 million people. That's 11.3% of the world severely food insecure. Over 11% of the world does not have enough food to eat. They go hungry and they are becoming and are malnourished. Climate disruption is going to be forced harder and harder and harder by our governments and corporations, and that number is going to skyrocket. I'll just go over now some of the sixth assessment, because the sixth assessment had some extremely alarming results and conclusions on food security. So the IPCC, does this burning embers risk diagrams, and they had one for food insecurity and they had one for food supply instability, and they were much the same. At 1.5 degrees C, we're getting into a high risk on our food security, high risk on what they call supply instabilities. So at 1.5 degrees C on food, the entire world is in big trouble. Of course, it much, much higher when you get up to 2 degrees C. Now, the IPCC published some fact sheets with the sixth assessment, and they had one on food and water. On food, here's what they said. Climate change impacts are negatively affecting agriculture, also fisheries and agriculture, hindering efforts to meet human needs. Human-induced global warming has slowed the growth of agricultural productivity. Our agriculture has been phenomenally, amazingly successful for many, many, many decades of progressively increasing world food production. But climate change now is clawing that back. So they say that global warming has slowed the growth of agricultural productivity over the past 50 years, they say. In mid and low latitudes is where the vast majority of the world's food are grown. They say that warming is negatively affecting crop quality and harvest stability. And of course, they mentioned ocean acidification and ocean warming are regularly affecting fish and farmed aquatic species. So there it is in no uncertain terms. The IPCC sixth assessment says that with regards to our food production, we are already in trouble. And really, that's painfully obvious by all the unprecedented extreme weather events we're having. We're having them in combination. And of course, they hit on food production. And they hit on food production everywhere, developed or developing regions, and the science has confirmed that. The IPC also had a section on a very important aspect of food shocks, climate shocks in particular, and they said that these are becoming more common. Climate-related hazards and shocks have become more common, disrupting the supply of crops, of meat and fish. And they mentioned again the global food supply has increased dramatically in the last century, but now we are losing because those gains are being cut back by climate change, particularly the extreme weather events. Now, in the 2018 1.5 degrees C assessment, they had a chart. It was an excellent chart comparing projected impacts on populations at 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. On water scarcity, we have over 2 billion people presently living in water-stressed regions. Now, at 1 degree C, that's going to increase 4%. That's huge. At 2 degrees C, it's going to be double, 8% more people under water scarcity, water stress. Also, we have 3.2 billion people living in agricultural areas with high to very high water stress already. The projections on crops are really rather stunning. At 1.5 degrees C, they project 35 million people experiencing lower yield. At 2 degrees C, that's increased tenfold. 3.50 or 3.60 million people experiencing suffering from lower crop yield at 2 degrees C. Our governments are sending us to an unlivable planet future of over 3 degrees C.
Thank you, Peter, for your thoughts. And it's really frightening to think about how so many people around the world are going to somehow survive with an ever decreasing output of nourishing food. And as you mentioned, safe, clean drinking water. So, we all know what it's like when you have more people competing for less. It doesn't turn out well. Paul, what do we have to look forward to on this planet of less food and more people?
Peter's gone into great detail of how disruptive warming temperatures will be to global food supplies as we proceed through this century. So, talking about numbers of expected temperature rise decades out is one thing, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the huge risks that we have of shorter term disruptions to global food supply. So we've often talked about the temperature rise imbalance on the surface of the Earth, creating distorted weather patterns, distorted, wavy, broken jet streams. And it turns out that the jet streams can get stuck in these certain modes where, as they circumvent the Earth, you can get simultaneous heat waves in various regions around the planet, and then simultaneous areas in between where the heat waves are, where you have torrential rains leading to flooding. And you can get these jet streams locking into place. So there are conceivable scenarios that are becoming riskier where we get this type of jet stream configuration locked in place that causes simultaneous heat waves and droughts over the main food producing regions of the Northern Hemisphere. And in other regions of the Northern Hemisphere, food growing regions, we would have torrential rains leading to flooding, which also destroys crops just as much as heat and drought. Such a scenario like that would lead to global food shortages. That could happen next year. It could happen in 5 years, in 10 years. I mean, the risk is getting higher and higher. So such a simultaneous failure of crops is a big concern in the short term. That's on top of the longer term risks of higher and higher temperatures. The other thing is that the climate change it's really unraveling civilization. As we see more and more extreme weather events destroying cities, that happen to be unlucky in the climate casino, we are going to struggle in the future to rebuild any of these cities. So you need obviously lots of money and you need lots of resources in order to rebuild devastated regions, whether it be New York from a Sandy, whether it be New Orleans from a Katrina, or any other place in the world. It doesn't matter where you are. I'm not talking just about poor, countries. It can happen everywhere. If you look at the number of billion-dollar disasters in the US, for example, over the last decade, you can see how those numbers are skyrocketing. So these, you have to ask yourself, well, at what point will countries basically run out of money and resources and the ability to rebuild these destroyed cities, destroyed infrastructure? So, let's talk at an even smaller level of the microcosm of what's happening in the Middle East right now, because we talk about global food shortages being a problem, but I would argue that there's over 2 million people in Gaza, and they don't have access to food, they don't have access to water, they don't have access to fuel, to electricity. You can last without water for about 3 days. So if there's no source of water, people are going to be dying just from lack of water. You can last, weeks to a month, maybe without food, but you end up looking like people, say, in the Warsaw Ghetto in World War II, right? When there's no supplies going in and out, fuel, no electricity, you're basically back in the dark ages. It's like you're living in the Stone Ages with no electricity. And put a fence around these millions of people and don't allow any access out by land or ocean on all sides. And you basically have a genocide in the case of when it's humans doing it against other humans. So this is a microcosm. So I would argue that this sort of thing can propagate and will propagate to many parts of the world at a faster and faster rate as climate change worsens, especially as tipping occurs in many climate systems. There's many nonlinear feedbacks. For example, we know that the ocean currents are slowing down. If they actually were to stop, the intertropical convergence zone of heavy rains moves southward from the equator. It's estimated that the Indian monsoon rainfall would be cut in half in such an event. So think of all of the billions of people that rely on the rains from the monsoon in that part of the world. So we're reaching all of these points where things are breaking, and they're going to break at ever faster rates. And humanity will be shocked continuously by these things happening. And food is a big part of it, but there's many, many other parts. I mean, when you can't rebuild the destruction of a city, people have to move to other regions. So they have to find somewhere else to live. And as climate change worsens and accelerates and tipping points are reached, there's fewer and fewer other regions in the world that people will be able to move to. And in fact, large parts of the planet we can expect will be uninhabitable to human existence in the near term future, according to the latest climate science.
Thank you for that, Paul. I was reading that as well. And we've spoken about this on previous shows here with the Climate Emergency Forum, that in particular, the MENA region, that is the Middle East and North Africa, will certainly be uninhabitable really in the near future, especially some major hotspots in Pakistan. And a lot of this food crisis, this water crisis, is absolutely brought to the fore and very important. I think also important and related to this is the effects on the human body, leaving out non-human animals and just speaking about humans. I know one of the effects of prolonged intense heat of say 40 degrees Celsius over many course of days, scientists have done studies that mothers, when they are breastfeeding their children, the milk that they are producing has got more water in it and less nutrition. So, breastfeeding is a very, very important thing in the life of a newborn. And of course, it's got essentially zero impact on the climate. Even this is being affected by climate change. And hey, that's a huge part of the food supply. And it's truly, truly frightening that the basic functioning of the human body is so incredibly compromised by this unceasing heat and the inability to nourish our very offspring. What does that mean for the future of humanity? And what does it mean for the health of these young babies who are just getting their start in the world? So when we think about the food supply and the climate chaos, I really think it's important to expand that definition because it really is quite expansive. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Peter Carter.
Yeah, thanks, Regina, and thanks, Paul. And I want to sort of bring us back to those important points that Paul made. So, first of all, on the short term, the European Central Bank published a report in May of this year in which they estimated that future warming will cause global increases in annual food inflation. Now, most of us are worried because most of us have seen that already. But what they project is that by 2035, the most climate and economic vulnerable regions will be experiencing an inflation in their food costs of 3% per year, which is absolutely horribly unimaginable. But in the United States and China, the food inflation is estimated by 2035 to go up by 1.5% per year. So, yes, as Paul says, right now, we're in big trouble with regards to our food security and food availability. Now, Paul also mentioned the Northern Hemisphere and the jet stream. And in fact, there was a paper published in July of this year, which was called The Risks of Synchronized Low Yield. This is specifically in the Northern Hemisphere, underestimated in climate and crop model projections. It was a most important paper. And it was adding in to the science what Paul talks about, the atmospheric circulations and the jet stream disturbances. Now, just a month before, in June of 2023, another paper was published, and the title of this paper is Surprising Heat and Drought Events in Wheat-Producing Regions of the United States and China. So the United States and China are the world's two biggest food, particularly cereal, producing regions. And heat and drought, now the scientists are finding, not unsurprisingly, is going to have a detrimental, awful effect on entire world food security, with the United States and China being affected. One other paper I want to mention is something that Paul knows more about than me, but it's that brilliant NASA Grace satellite duo up there that are really great at projecting drought. So a paper was published by those experts in March of this year. And this paper said as follows, and it just confirms everything that we've been saying, continued warming of the planet will cause more frequent, more severe, longer, and larger droughts and floods. So there you have it. The scientists who are doing the work are telling us in no uncertain terms that we just cannot allow the governments to continue pushing more and more and more fossil fuels, because that the IPCC warned would lead to an unlivable future. The IPCC said we have a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future, right? So our governments are condemning us to literally no future. So thank you for the scientists for doing that work. And thank you for us and other people out there that are trying to communicate this to the public. And hopefully some of this will filter down to those so-called leaders who are leading us to a future of misery and oblivion.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. Misery and oblivion. There's so many different things that we're going to have to do if we are to protect the food supply. We're going to have to somehow find a way to scale up climate adaptation and develop crops, perhaps through genetic means that can withstand higher heat and lower water. There's going to have to be some type of solution, unless, of course, as you suggest, there's going to be mass deaths on a global scale. Paul, do you have anything to add before we sign out?
Yeah, I just want to say that, all food is not equal. So, with rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns, some plants grow differently. And, often the part of the plant that we eat, maybe just the grains, for example, the seeds for grains, that part loses nutritional value with warmer temperatures. And, if the plant is growing much faster with higher CO2 levels, depending on precipitation, then the nutritional value, the value to humans as food is less. Also, I mentioned the scenario of maybe the ocean currents slowing down, and it's estimated that if that was to happen, that tipping point, and the risk is getting greater and greater that might happen. So basically, the nutritional value of plants can decrease, but also if the AMOC was to shut down, the ocean currents were to slow down, it's estimated that we would lose the land available to grow grains by anywhere from a half to 2/3. Also for maize would be greatly reduced. So, the good thing is that, it would be much harder to grow kale as well. Who likes eating that stuff? But anyway, we have huge issues in our ability to grow food going out. We've been lucky, say, over the last century with the Green Revolution, ever increasing food yields, et cetera. But again, a lot of the ever increasing food yields were due to fossil fuel-based fertilizers.
Thank you, Paul, for making that very important point. And listen, count me in as someone who enjoys kale. I love it in various recipes, I must say. Soup and salad, it goes just fine. You could even add a little bit of wine. So listen, we all have to take our pleasures when we can in this dying world. And I suggest that we embrace good food, good friends, family, and because we need to keep our spirits up. And one of the ways that we here at Climate Emergency Forum keep our spirits up is by reading your comments. So if you have any comments in relation to whatever we've spoken about, please leave them for us so that we can read them and hear more about your thoughts. We really like going through those. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time at the Climate Emergency Forum.